Good evening, and welcome back to our Parsha webcast. We've not given this class in a few weeks, and it's nice to be back. So we're going to talk about this week's Parsha, which is the portion of Balak. And at the end of this Parsha, there's a very disturbing story, one that is very famous, the story of Zimri, the head of the tribe of Shimon, or one of the heads of the tribe of Shimon, who cohabited with a non-Jewish woman, with a Midianite woman in public. And just prior to having done that, he brought her to Moshe and asked if he is permitted to be with her, and of course the answer was no. He said, if the answer is no, then why are you permitted to be married to Tziporah, which was also a Midianite woman, a non-Jewish woman? And he went ahead and did the terrible sin. And the rest of the story is that Pinchas, a young man, Moshe's nephew, his great-nephew, took a spear and killed Zimri and the Midianite woman together. And that deed, that act of zealotry, had calmed down the anger of Hashem, and it was a terrible plague that struck the Jewish people ceased, and he was greatly rewarded for that, as we will learn in the beginning of next week's portion. Now, this story begs for much clarification, because when you think about the details, there's a lot that is left unanswered here. Now, we'll start with a few questions. Question number one, why was Moshe allowed to marry Tziporah? And the obvious answer is because he was married to her before the Torah was given, and after the Torah was given, just like all the other Jews officially became the Jewish part of the Jewish people. In other words, they were born as a nation during Matan Torah, during the Torah, the revelation at Sinai. So collectively, all the Jews had to undergo some form of conversion. Or that the actual Matan Torah was a form of conversion for the Jewish people, because they all had the status of Gentiles, of Bnei Noach, not Jewish people, prior to them becoming Jewish at Matan Torah. So she was among them all, and she therefore converted together with all the Jewish people, and she was therefore permitted to live with Moshe Rabbeinu, to be married to him. So that's the obvious answer why she was allowed to be married to Moshe. The question then becomes, if it's so simple, and it is, it's so obvious the difference, how could it be that Zimri, this leader of a tribe, who is undoubtedly a great scholar in his own right, how could it be that he didn't understand or know such an obvious distinction between what he was doing and what Moshe did? And that she was permitted for the obvious reason that she was married to him already before the Torah was given, and at the event of the revelation at Sinai, she underwent the same conversion together with everyone else, and she was therefore perfectly permitted to be with Moshe, because at that time she was Jewish. And the next question, why don't we find anywhere that Moshe answered this obvious distinction to Zimri? The Torah just tells us the next thing we know is that he's being stabbed with a spear by Pinchas. No questions answered. There was no discussion, no conversation. They killed him, and that's it. Why doesn't he deserve an answer to a legitimate question? Let's ask another couple of questions. We know that a convert is allowed to marry a Jewish person, of course, but a convert is not allowed to marry a Kohen. That means a woman convert cannot marry a Kohen even after she converts and she becomes Jewish. Now, the question then is, we know that Moshe was a Kohen. There are two opinions whether he was a Kohen all his life, because his children were not Kohanim, that's true, because of God punished him when he doubted God, and it's during the Exodus, when he was speaking to him at the burning bush. But that punishment was only for his children, but he himself, according to this opinion, remained a Kohen all his life. There's another opinion that says he wasn't a Kohen all his life. He was a Kohen during the week of the inauguration of the temple, of the tabernacle that they built in the desert. Either way, he was a Kohen either for his whole life or during that week, which leaves us with the question, how was he allowed to be married to Tziporah if she was a convert? So that's also an interesting question that needs to that we need to have an answer for that. Why was he allowed to be married to a convert if he's a Kohen? So the Rebbe explains in a Sikha that the truth is these two questions that we asked. Number one, how could it be that Zimri, this great scholar and leader of a tribe, doesn't know the obvious difference between the marriage of Moshe to Tziporah, which happened before the Torah was given and they all converted? And this question, how could she have married to Moshe if he was a Kohen and she was a convert? The truth is these two questions are answered one and the other. In other words, maybe indeed the question that Zimri was asking Moshe wasn't whether or not he was allowed to be married to her because she was not Jewish. Because he understood that she was Jewish, she became Jewish at Matan Torah. But his question was a different question. Why indeed was he allowed to be married to her even though she's Jewish? In other words, because since she is a convert, why is he permitted to be married to her? And that was Zimri's question. But then we're left with two questions, and that is, number one, why indeed was Moshe allowed to be married to her? And this question number two, again, why didn't he give, if there's a reason why he's allowed to be married to her, why didn't he share that reason with Zimri? After all, it's a legitimate question. And you might say that Zimri acted in a brazen fashion, challenging Moshe in front of the whole nation, but still, it is a question. It's a halachic question with strong basis. Everyone knows the law that you're not allowed to be married to a convert. How was Moshe allowed to be married to this convert, since he was a Kohen? So why doesn't he deserve an answer? There are some that want to say that indeed, we know the story that we learned a few portions ago, that Miriam and Aaron spoke negatively, Lashon Hara, about Moshe, that he had separated and divorced his wife, and she was punished with leprosy because of it. So some that want to say that indeed, for that very reason, Moshe wasn't married to Tziporah. He had actually divorced her. So there's no question anymore, how could you be married to Tziporah? Indeed, he wasn't married to Tziporah. And this was something that was kept away from the public eye. No one knew about it. Even Miriam didn't know about it, till Tziporah herself had shared this information with Miriam. So here you have the sister of Moshe doesn't know that he separated and divorced his wife. He kept it secret. Why did he keep it secret? Perhaps because he made that decision on his own, according to some opinions, to divorce her. So he didn't. So he kept it secret. He didn't want to make a big deal of it. So certainly Zimri didn't know either. So therefore, when Zimri approached Moshe and asked him the question, "How did you have the right? How do you have? If you're going to tell me that I'm not allowed to live with this Midianite woman, who gives you the right to live with your Midianite woman, which is a convert, since you're a Kohen? And he doesn't know that he divorced her. So there you can. So that explains it all. The problem is the Rebbe continues to question. He says that doesn't really add up, and the reason is because when you look into the details of that story where Miriam spoke about Moshe and she was punished with being a leper, and she had mentioned the fact that he divorced his wife, over there, if you remember, the reason he divorced his wife had nothing to do with the fact that he was a Kohen. The reason over there that's given for him having divorced his wife was because he was a high-level prophet who was always called upon by God, and sometimes even by surprise, meaning at any moment he could be speaking to God and have a prophetic vision and experience, and therefore he needed to be completely dedicated to God and ready in holiness and purity to have this revelation of prophecy. So therefore he had to divorce his wife. That was the case with Moshe. Of course, other prophets don't have to divorce their wife because they don't have prophecy whenever they feel like it, whenever they have to have preparation. So they could be married, and they can engage in marital life, and when they're ready to have a prophetic vision, and God is going to, they prepare themselves, they go to the mikveh, they purify themselves, and they can have their prophetic vision. But Moshe didn't have that preparation time. God would appear to him instantly, any time. He had to be ready all the time for a revelation from God. So therefore he couldn't possibly be married at that time. So he had to divorce her, but it had nothing to do with the fact that he was a Kohen. And nowhere do we find that he would have divorced her because he was a Kohen. In other words, had it just been for the fact that he was a Kohen, he would be permitted to live with her. So we're back to square one. Why indeed was he, as a Kohen, allowed to be married to Tziporah? And how is Zimri, this leader of the tribe of Shimon, how is his question answered by all of this? And why didn't he get an answer? So the answer to this question is a very interesting one. And there's a beautiful lesson at the end of it. There's an interesting mitzvah in the Torah which says as follows, that a Kohen, there's two types of Kohens. There's a regular Kohen and there's a high priest. The high priest has different laws than the regular Kohen has. For example, a regular Kohen is not allowed to be married to a convert, to a divorcee, and so on. A high priest has an extra added limitation, and he's not allowed to be married to a widow either. In other words, if someone was widowed, he's not allowed to marry her. He has to marry a virgin. So not a widow, not a divorce, he has to marry a virgin. What happens? The Mishnah tells us an interesting scenario. What happens if a regular Kohen decides to get married to a widow, which is perfectly permitted? He's not allowed to marry a divorcee, but since he's not a high priest, he is allowed to marry a widow. So what happens if a regular Kohen betrothes a widow? And I want to explain what I mean by betroths a widow. In olden times, in biblical times, the marriages happened in two phases. First, they would betroth a wife, which means he would give her the ring and say, you are married to me with this ring. And then she would technically be married. Halachically, she would be married. And but she would not yet move into the home of her new husband. She would take a period of 12 months or whatever to prepare for a marriage ceremony, what we call the chuppah, and the celebration. And after 12 months, or maybe less, or whatever they agreed upon, they would then have the chuppah, and he would then bring her home to live with him as a married couple. So there's two stages. One is kiddushin, marriage and one is chuppah. One is kiddushin. This is what we would call betrothing, and the second phase, 12 months later or so, would be called marriage. Today we do them both together. Under the chuppah, the groom gives the bride the ring and says to her that you are married to me with this ring. And right then there's also the chuppah and the blessings and all that. But in olden times it wasn't that way. So the Mishnah gives us the following scenario. What happens if a regular Kohen, he's not a high priest, and therefore he's permitted to marry a widow. So he wants to marry a widow, and he betroths a widow. He goes through the first stage of marriage with this widow. So she's technically married to him in the sense that she is now his wife. She doesn't live with him yet. They still have not undergone the nisuin, the chuppah ceremony, but she's halachically his wife. But then, before he actually completes the marriage ceremony under the chuppah, he is then promoted and he becomes the high priest. So you have an interesting scenario. He married this woman, he did the first phase of marriage, he gave her the ring and betrothed her to him while he was permitted, because he was not a high priest. But then he has the good fortune and he is now promoted as the high priest. Is he allowed to go forth and continue this marriage, in other words, complete it with a chuppah, even though she is a widow and he is already by now, a high priest? So the Mishnah says he is allowed to finalize and formalize the marriage with a chuppah, since when he betrothed her, which is one can say the main part of the kiddushin, or the first stage of the kiddushin of the marriage, he took her and acquired her halachically. He was permitted, so he's allowed to complete the transaction, to complete the marriage, and take her as his wife with the chuppah, and take her home and live with her as his wife. And we learn this from the specific wording in the verse where it says that a high priest is not allowed to marry a widow. Over there, the language that is used leads us to believe, and this we receive through the oral tradition, that one is allowed to complete a marriage if it happened in such a way. Now, if that's the case by a high priest and a widow, in the case of Moshe and Tziporah, his wife, we can say the same thing. When did he marry her? When did he begin the marriage to her? When he was still permitted, before the Torah was given. No problem. And by the way, the types of marriages that took place before the Torah was given was similar. That was one mitzvah for whatever reason. The one mitzvah that the Jewish people were given still in Egypt, we're told, was the mitzvah of marriage, that their marriages should be the way they are done after the Torah was given, this in the same fashion. So you have a scenario where Moshe marries Tziporah, halachically, soundly. Now he is promoted, he becomes a Kohen after the Torah is given. Now he becomes a Kohen. So the question now is he allowed to continue being married to Tziporah? The answer is obvious, that he is allowed to, just like the high priest is allowed to continue the marriage ceremony and formalize it and complete it, because when he took her in the first stage, he was then not yet a high priest and he was allowed to. The same thing over here, since Moshe was allowed to be married to Tziporah before the Torah was given and he became a Kohen, when that became prohibited. When did it become prohibited for a Kohen to be married to a convert? Only after the Torah was given. So in truth, Moshe was a Kohen even before the Torah was given, but the prohibition for a Kohen to be married to a convert was not in place till after the Torah was given. In other words, when Moshe married Tziporah the convert, she was permitted to be married to Moshe. So since he was permitted to marry Moshe, she was permitted to be married to him before, when he took her, when he married her. This was a perfectly halachically legitimate marriage. So therefore later, when this becomes prohibited, since he was already married, is kind of like grandfathered in, and he's allowed to continue living with her. And this, by the way, was the debate between Zimri, the leader of the tribe of Shimon, and Moshe. What happens over here, therefore, is like this. Zimri comes over to Moshe with this Midianite woman, and he tells him, he asks him, is this woman allowed to be married to me? Am I allowed to be with this woman? She's not Jewish, she's a Midianite. And if you're going to tell me that she's not, then why are you permitted to, as a kohen, to be married to your wife? Yeah, you're right. Before the Torah was given, you were married to her legally, but now the Torah was given, and you are no longer permitted to be married to her. A legitimate question. What does Moshe tell him? Nothing. He doesn't tell him anything. He doesn't tell him the answer that we just gave, that because he was already married to her legally before the Torah was given, therefore he's allowed to be married to her now. It's kind of like the high priest with the widow. He's kind of grandfathered in. The reason he didn't answer him this is very, very, very simple reason. Moshe had no textual proof to this. Meaning this law that you're allowed to continue to be married as long as you married her before, legally, is not a clear verse in the Torah. This Moshe, if he would have told him that law, Zimri would have right away asked him, how do you know this? And Moshe would have told him, well, I heard it from, I received this as part of the oral tradition from God. Zimri would not have believed him. Why would he not have believed him? Because in this case, and this is the law, by the way, when a rabbi, a scholar, a rabbinical figure is asked a question, and he is personally connected somehow. And in this case, of course, the question was about Moshe's own wife. So he was subjective. He wasn't objective. This was about him. So when a chacham, when a Talmud chacham, a scholar, a rabbinical figure is asked a question, so if it's just a question about someone else, so you can rely that he's giving you an objective answer, and if he tells you, I received it as a tradition, you can believe him, and you should believe him. But if the question is about his wife, or about him personally, and he answers you, the answer is that I'm allowed to, and because, how do you know? Because I received this as a tradition, you're not under any obligation to believe him, because he's not objective. Therefore, Moshe knew, no matter what I told Zimri in this case, my words would fall on deaf ears, because Zimri is not under any obligation to believe me, because I'm not objective here. This is about my wife. So there's no point in me even getting into a conversation with him, because he's not going to believe me anyway. Because again, he didn't have clear textual proof to this law. It's based on the oral tradition that he heard from God at Mount Sinai. So there you have it. That's the answer to both of these questions. Number one, why was he allowed to marry her? Yeah, because. You're right, she is a convert, he is a kohen, but he was allowed to continue to be married to her because he was already married to her when he was still permitted. He took her as a wife according to Jewish law. Halachically permitted to do that, because at that time there was no prohibition for a kohen to be married to a convert. Remember, we're talking about before the Torah was given then. He married her way before the Torah was given. And the fact that the Torah is now given, and the law that a kohen is no longer not allowed to be married, this is a new law that was given at Sinai, that a kohen is not allowed to be married to a convert, doesn't apply to Moshe, because Moshe was already married to her before. Zimri was not going to buy that, because Moshe had no textual proof of this. No clear textual proof. There's no chapter and verse that he can point to. It's based on the oral tradition. And since we're talking about Moshe's own wife, where he's not objective, he's very subjective, so the Zimri and the Jew and anyone asking this question is not under any obligation to just take Moshe's word for it. So therefore Moshe's word would not have made any difference here anyway. So that's why Moshe doesn't answer Zimri. What does happen? Pinchas takes a spear and kills him. Why does he kill him? Because the law is that a man that cohabits with a Midianite woman or any non-Jewish woman, so while they're engaged in the act, you're allowed to kill them to protect the honor of the Jewish people, to protect the honor of the Torah. And that's what happened over here. Zimri was so brazen in his act. He took her in public, cohabited with her in public, or at least in front of the people that were there. And Pinchas, therefore, took the initiative, and he fulfilled the law that someone that married, that cohabits with a Gentile woman is allowed to be, should be put to death and gets the death penalty if you witness it while it is going on. What do we have a lesson from this whole story? A very interesting one indeed. Number one, and this is a lesson for everyone, there's some questions that are asked that don't deserve an answer. Why not? Some questions deserve an answer, but some don't. Which question deserves an answer? An innocent one. A person comes to you, even if he's not the smartest person in the world, one can consider him a nudnik, but he means it. He's asking a legitimate question. You got to answer him. You got to be patient. You have to answer every question every person asks. Even if you feel that he's just, a little lazy, he's not, he could do better figuring that out himself. But if he means well, he's asking a serious, honest question, you got to answer it to him. But then there's some people that ask questions, their whole reason for questioning is only to challenge, to look for a way to permit living with a Gentile woman. In the case of Zimri, that's all his question was. He wanted to permit himself to calm his conscience for living with this woman. And he wasn't looking for an answer. He was looking to just question and prove that he's right. There, you don't have to answer. There's no point. Because he's not looking for an answer. He's looking to question. And if you'll answer him this, he'll ask you another 3 questions. It'll never end. Such a person you have to deal with according to law, and the law was dealt with by Pinchas. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that God was very pleased with his act of zealotry, and he calmed his anger, and the plague that initially struck the Jewish people ceased. What I want to end off with is, since we're just one day away from the great holiday of Yud Beis Tammuz, the 12th of Tammuz. The 12th of Tammuz is the day that the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was released from his prison sentence in 1927. It's a long story. First he was sentenced to death. That was changed for a 10-year prison term in Siberia, which was then changed for 3 years in Kostroma, which is closer to where he lived. And that was also changed, and only after 9 days in that prison he was released. So the entire ordeal was 27 days. And as I mentioned, he was given the news that he's going to be a free man on the 12th of Tammuz, and he actually was freed on the 13th. And this became an incredible holiday, a great holiday amongst the Jewish people, the Chabad Hasidim, and by extension by many other Jews. And it really is a celebration for the entire Jewish people, because when you think about the previous Rebbe, he was in a sense a Pinchas of our time. He was the Moses of our time, of his generation, and he was the Pinchas of his time. What was Pinchas? He was one can say a zealot. What does a zealot mean? A zealot means someone that goes all the way. He's completely committed. The previous Rebbe was completely committed to God, to Torah, to the Jewish people. And think about the time that he lived in and the place where he lived. He lived in Russia in 1920s under Stalin's ruthless regime, and they killed Jews, tortured Jews just because they wanted to live as Jews. And the previous Rebbe stood up to that regime, stood up to that force with tremendous fortitude. And he paid the price, of course, but we have Judaism today in Russia thriving just a short, less than 100 years later, Judaism in Russia today is blossoming, thriving everywhere. The previous Rebbe and the Rebbe's his own shluchim, numbering in the high hundreds, are all over the former Soviet Union spreading Yiddishkeit. And one can say that the previous Rebbe won this war against Stalin and the Bolsheviks and the Jewish section of the communist regime, which were maybe the worst of all. And today they're in the history books. They're gone completely. There's no trace of them. Communism in Russia is a thing of the past. Stalin is a thing of the past. Today Judaism thrives. The previous Rebbe's pictures hanging all over Russia. The Rebbe's pictures hanging all over Russia. There are thousands and thousands of children all over this former Soviet Union learning Torah, davening, wearing tzitzis, keeping Shabbos. Their parents their families are keeping kosher. The mothers are going to the mikveh. Doing all the things the previous Rebbe fought for, and for which Yud Beis Tammuz, the 12th of Tammuz, is an incredible, became the holiday to celebrate that victory. May Hashem help that we should be reunited with our Rebbe and with the previous Rebbe to celebrate the 12th of Tammuz with them together with us, with the coming of Mashiach. May it be speedily in our days. And the lesson for us is that we should also, although we don't live under any Stalin regime, we live in a free country, but we do have our own challenges, and we have to sometimes muster up the strength of Pinchas and not always get into a whole back and forth debate with the Zimris of our time, and sometimes we act as the Zimri in our own life. We have a Yetzer Hara, we have our own evil inclination that tries to pose a challenge and question this, that, and the other. Sometimes it's best to just shut it out and not even get into a conversation, because they're not looking for an answer, they're just looking to challenge and looking to question. You have to know when an answer is in place, when it's called for, and when it's just a waste of time. So may Hashem help that we should learn from the examples of the Pinchas of then and the Moshe Rabbeinu of then and the Moshe Rabbeinu of our times, and be inspired to find that inner strength, that inner zealotry that we all possess in the things that are important to us. May Yiddishkeit become very important to us, and we should be ready to devote ourselves to it through fire and water. Have a wonderful week, and I'm happy to be back, as I said, and we'll see you next week for Parshas Pinchas. Have a good day.